When it comes to this whole discussion of dispersal versus vicariance, of course, here in Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific, we can basically assign everything to some kind of a dispersal process because, of course, we know that we have these volcanic islands that have emerged from the ocean in different periods of time, with the older islands around 5 million years old and the big island at less than 1 million years old. However, there are some details about the island's formation that actually mean that there are some other processes going on. And let's go ahead and start with the fact that as volcanoes build, these are really large structures. And we can sort of look at it as this sort of incremental building up of lava above the ocean surface. But the reality is a lot of what's happening is going on over long periods of time. So let's kind of just think about this conveyor belt of the Hawaiian Islands where we have the plate moving, we have a hot spot forming a volcano, and then as the plate moves that volcano away, we have an older volcano, and then this one over here is even older with a new, younger volcano forming at this end. Now, in a very simple sense, this just makes a series of islands that are entirely dependent on dispersal. But a lot of what's happening is underwater, and there's another tectonic process that's going on, and this has to do with subsidence. So we usually think about the plates moving from side to side, but because these volcanoes are such big weights on the crust, they actually sink down as they build, and so it pushes the crust down a bit, and so we have some actual evidence of how the islands used to be before this sinking occurred. First of all, lava that builds up underwater builds up very steeply, and then it makes this very gradual flowing when it's above the water. And so we get this kind of sharp angle, this change in the slope where we had lavas that were formed underwater versus above water. The other thing is we have the formation of coral reefs, which need to form in shallow water, actually forming or having formed in what's now much deeper water, meaning those deep areas used to be more shallow. And we can see this in sonar scans. This is a side view of a sonar scan of the sea floor to the east of Maui. And so you can see that change in slope right here. So everything above that slope was formed above water. Everything below that slope, that change in slope was formed below water. In terms of the volcanic activity. And then we have all of these little traces, all of these little reef formations, and those represent coral reefs that were there in different locations as the water level changed as that island sank down into the crust. And we can sort of extend this back in time so that we actually had periods of time when there were much larger islands with several volcanoes in some cases joined together to form a single island, the way that the Big Island does today. The Big Island is sort of an agglomeration of 5 different volcanoes. And so because this process has been ongoing, going back 30 million years, we can sort of see the changes where we did indeed in certain cases have islands joining together from separate volcanoes and then gradually sinking away and splitting up. The most dramatic of these, and the most recent, is the group of islands that we now refer to as the Maui Nui Complex. Maui and its neighbors in the past, and we can see these different features. This is the original shoreline, this H terrace, this change in slope. You can see it in the contour lines here, and then also evidenced by these coral reefs. When we sort of add all of this up, we can see that we had a single large island a little over 1 million years ago, where what are now the peaks of, at the time, an island with several different volcanoes, in fact 6, those now have gradually sunk down to the point where they've split up into separate islands. And this means that we formed a water barrier because of a tectonic process. We also have some sea level change going on with climate change that complicates this. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But what we end up with is the possibility for vicariance. But this is something that we only discovered more recently by going into lava tube caves, which preserve fossils. The fossils they preserve are of birds, including this rail. We do not have them in Hawaii anymore, and this giant flightless goose. These are flightless birds. By the way, this thing is about the size of a tom turkey, but with very long leg bones. So this was a big bird. And it was entirely flightless. And we had quite a few species of these. Some of them are more closely related to ducks. Some of them are more closely related to geese, and in fact to our nene. But almost all of them were completely flightless. And when you have these large flightless birds walking around, feeding on vegetation the way that maybe a deer or a goat or some other hoofed mammal might today, you can imagine they're going to be restricted and not be able to disperse over water. Another group of flightless birds were ibises. These are birds that live on the forest floor and probably feed on insects and other things. And it turns out that we, in fact, have a number of these species on different islands in what had been that Maui Nui large island. So we have members of this group, they're completely flightless on Molokai and Lanai and Maui. And they certainly didn't swim across that channel. These are completely flightless birds. They had to have walked across, and then when the island sunk down and the water level split up those islands, we have a case of vicariance. So even in Hawaii, it's not entirely dispersal. We also have vicariance in the ocean. And we're going to be talking about the reading where the Isthmus of Panama emerged to connect North and South America. However, it split up the ocean on either side. And so we have closely related shrimp species on either side of this barrier. Certainly these tropical tropical coral reef dwelling shrimp species are not going to crawl across the land. They're not going to be carried by a bird across, and they're certainly not going to swim all the way around the south side of South America. So this is not a case of dispersal. Even with pelagic larvae, these guys are not going to be able to disperse through these really harsh waters all the way to the northern end of North America or South America. And in this case, we have a very clear case of vicariance where, in this case, a land barrier emerged between populations that were living in the ocean on either side. There are also cases where we're not entirely sure what happened in terms of dispersal or vicariance, but we can make a good guess. So for example, this is a group of trees called Nothophagus. We find them in Australia and New Zealand, and then again disjunct over in South America. However, we have fossils of them in Antarctica. And again, we know that South America, Antarctica, and Australia were all connected as a part of this Gondwana land continent in the past. Yes, the tree could have dispersed from one to the other, but we have good reason to believe, based on circumstantial evidence, that this was probably a case of vicariance. However, it's very hard to be certain. Here's another case. This is a group of birds called the ratites. Almost all of these birds are flightless, and they are also found on fragments of this Gondwana land continent, this supercontinent across the southern hemisphere. These include the moa of New Zealand, the elephant bird, a very large ostrich-like bird from Madagascar, the kiwi of New Zealand, and ostriches, as well as the cassowary of Australia. So these are flightless birds, and so the story goes, they have been sort of gradually moved apart from each other and now are disjunct across these fragments. Now, what's come out recently is that they're actually related to another bird that actually can fly short distances. And so now there's the question of maybe that this could have been dispersal. Maybe their ancestors flew between these different areas, although again, the circumstantial evidence suggests vicariance. Here's another case of dispersal or vicariance, the tenrex. This is a very strange little mammal in Madagascar. There are some species, however, in Africa. And we know that Madagascar used to be part of Africa and then split off. And so there's the possibility that they rafted there, but there is also the possibility that it was part of vicariance. In the case of these guys, however, between genetics and timing and other kinds of things, we now believe these probably were a case of dispersal because they probably were capable of rafting from Africa to Madagascar. Now, we also have cases where we have continents coming together. And a really nice case is the case of the elephants and their relatives, the so-called proboscideans. And this is several families of elephants and their relatives: mammoths, mastodons, stegodons, gomphotheres. These were actually very diverse. They originated on the African continent when it was an island continent. Africa then connected to Eurasia, Eurasia connected to North America, and then North America connected to South America. And so this group of animals was able to spread out of Africa across all of the major continents except Australia. And as they moved into those different habitats, some of them adapted, becoming species that were found in tundra environments, boreal forest environments, and basically occupying all of the major biomes of the world, and spreading to all the major continents except Australia, but having started out on the island continent of Africa where they first developed. So this is a case of migration and diversification, but that migration was made possible, in this case, not by continents splitting up, but by continents coming back together. And there is a group of biogeographers, although this has really now fallen out of fashion, who practice what's called pan-biogeography, or what's called vicariance biogeography. And these biogeographers basically say that everything is because of vicariance and continental movements. The reality is we have so much evidence now for long-distance dispersal, and of course in places like Hawaii this is very clear, that these biogeographers focused on vicariance maybe are a little over-focused on that. And so something that they do is they make these maps and they do this thing called generalized tracks, which are basically tracking similarities or disjunct groups of species or families of plants or animals and sort of connecting these areas to suggest how the continents have moved around to shape things. Of course, nowadays we realize that long-distance dispersal is actually very important, especially on oceanic islands, but even in between continents. Another thing that occurs, and this we'll talk about more when we talk about the evolution and adaptation, is the idea of endemism, which is to say when a group of species are isolated to or limited to a given continent, or an island for that matter, over time they'll evolve and become very unique. And this is the concept of endemism. And so Australia, because we had marsupials in Australia, but not other groups of mammals, generally speaking, marsupials evolved to fill all of these niches. So we have kangaroos that are maybe acting like a deer would. We have other critters living up in the forest canopy that are sort of acting like maybe monkeys or sloths. We even had predators, and these were endemic to Australia. And this is the same thing that was occurring with the dinosaurs. When you split up the continents, species become endemic on those microcontinents, or let's say those island continents. And this plays into our reading as well. Overall then, we can think about these processes helping to shape Wallace's zoogeographic regions, and it helps to explain why the Australian region is so distinct, and why we have certain things that are limited to Africa because they never managed to spread into Eurasia, etc. And the same is somewhat true for Toctajean's classification, and we can see just a hint of this idea of vicariance in Toctajean's classification, because we have so many disjunctures between things that were found in South America and then New Zealand. And again, that's because of that ancient Gondwana connection. The reality, though, is that there have been so many other processes going on that this region doesn't hold true. Nonetheless, that Gondwana imprint on the flora, on the plants that we find, like the Araucaria in those areas, helped to shape Toctajean's view of the world.